Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at questions of development and global politics. In this video, we're going to problematize the idea of development itself. That is, we're going to ask, what do we mean when we say development? And how is that idea related to ideas of progress, or of equality, or of justice, or of growth? So if you're ready, let's get into it. Historical context is important here. Remember that most of the countries we now think of as developing gained their independence in the years after World War II, while most of the Americas gained their independence from Spain and Portugal in the early 1800s. Most of Africa and Asia remained colonies until after World War II. Following Indian independence in 1947, a wave of decolonization spread across Asia and Africa. And remember also that this is all taking place at the peak of Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In an effort to recruit allies from the Global South in the Cold War standoff, both the US and the USSR advocated developmental paths for the developing world. The United Nations took an active role as well, forming the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, both aimed at providing a path for development in the Global South. In his 1949 inaugural address, U.S. President Harry Truman summarized the thinking of the day. In that speech, he outlined a four-point plan to secure a liberal international order that he argued would promote peace and development. Importantly, this was also viewed as an important bulwark against the spread of communism and the expansion of power of the Soviet Union. Truman's plan focused first on promoting multilateralism supported by the United Nations and related agencies in order to promote democracy and encourage peaceful settlement of disputes. It also advocated supporting the continued post-war economic recovery of Europe and around the world, while simultaneously promoting the expansion of international trade. Third, it advocated for engaging in collective security and preventing the spread of communism by strengthening freedom-loving nations against the dangers of aggression. This idea was at the heart of the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, that year, as well as the Truman Doctrine of providing aid and assistance to anti-communist forces around the world. And fourth, it also advocated for the promotion of economic development in the Global South. What exactly did he say about this? Let's listen. Truman was hardly alone, either in his understanding of development or in his promotion of it. Development was conceptualized largely in terms of industrialization and economic growth. That is, a larger economy meant a country was more developed. And at the same time, outlining a path for economic development in the Global South was viewed as a central part of American and Soviet Cold War strategy. Interestingly, all of the early mainstream models of development centered on an understanding of development that privileged industrialization. But by the 1970s, it was clear that industrialization did not necessarily equal development, and indeed several problems were quickly emerging. First, development was largely conceived of in purely economic terms, leaving broader questions unanswered. Even in countries where economic growth was being achieved, questions were being raised. Is this actually progress? Are our daily lives getting better? Are there benefits of growth distributed equally? And is this process even sustainable? Second, development was conceptualized through the 1970s largely centered in the formal sector and as such privileged men, while largely ignoring or cutting out all other aspects of the economy and society, including the role of women, the informal sector, non-cash sector employment, and subsistence agriculture. All of this despite the fact that women performed the majority of work in most countries, and the informal sector represented the majority of all economic activity. The Aswan High Dam, constructed between 1960 and 1976 in Egypt and pictured here, illustrated these concerns. Originally conceived of as a central pillar in the independent Egyptian development strategy, the dam quickly raised questions around sustainability and exclusion. The process of constructing the dam resulted in the forced relocation of more than 100,000 people. Numerous Egyptian and Nubian archaeological sites dating back to antiquity were submerged by the new reservoir, and the seasonal flooding on which small farmers relied was replaced by more controlled irrigation schemes which tended to benefit wealthier farmers and fueled dependency on chemical inputs in agriculture. But the dam simultaneously permitted a sharp increase in sugar production for export, and more exports meant more foreign exchange earnings. The electricity generated by the dam also increased total electrical production in Egypt and helped fuel the country's industrialization. Even today, more than 50 years after its completion, the dam continues to provide about 15% of Egypt's total electricity supply. So while the completion of the dam brought clear benefits to Egypt, those benefits came with some steep costs, and those costs were not evenly distributed across society. So is this development? Is this progress? Based on per capita gross domestic product, the World Bank and most other organizations divide the countries of the world into a number of groups. These numbers increase slightly year to year to account for inflation, but in 2020, the current classifications were high-income countries, defined as those with a per capita GDP of more than $12,375, or about $34 per person per day. Middle-income countries are those countries with a GDP per capita of between $1,026 and $12,375. These countries are further subdivided into lower middle-income countries with per capita GDPs of between $1,026 and $3,895, and upper middle-income countries with per capita GDPs between $3,897 and $12,374. Finally, we have low-income countries with a per capita GDP of less than $1,026, or about $2.80 per person per day. Already, we should see that these categories are obscuring some important distinctions. First, the categories themselves are problematic. There's a big difference within each category, especially within the middle-income country group, which classifies countries like Zimbabwe, which has a per capita GDP of about $1,300, and the Russian Federation with a per capita GDP of about $11,000 within the same category. Or even within the high-income countries group, there's a big difference between a country like Palau, say, with its per capita GDP of about $17,000, and Norway with its per capita GDP of about $82,000. Or what about the division of countries into categories? Why is the line drawn where it is? Is there really a big difference between a GDP per capita of $1,000 in a country like Tanzania, which is therefore classified as a low-income developing country, and a country like Benin, whose per capita GDP places it into the middle-income category? Does the extra $200 per person in GDP between Tanzania and Benin really represent a qualitative difference in living standards between the two countries? Probably not. There are also a couple of groups of countries that are particularly problematic. The first are the so-called transition countries. These are the former Soviet bloc countries of Central and Eastern Europe. While classified as middle income, the nature of their economic transition from communist economies make their economy structure look very different than most other middle income countries. Second, there's also a number of high-income developing countries, like the oil-rich Gulf states. These countries generally have a very high per capita GDP, but often have economies structured like other developing countries around the export of a single primary commodity, in this case oil. But as we consider in another video, gross domestic product leaves a lot to be desired as a proxy for broader understandings of development. Indeed, if the goal of development is to improve the human condition, GDP per capita tells us incredibly little. But what if we think more creatively about what we mean by development? This is a composite satellite image of the Earth at night. What does this tell us about development? A lot, I think. Note the areas that are lit up at night. While Europe, the United States, and Japan are clearly visible, much of the global south remains dark. A handful of very large cities whose lights are shown in white are visible in the global south. Cairo, Johannesburg, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Beijing, and others are visible, but large portions of the global south, particularly in South America, Africa, and South Asia outside of India, are not. This also tells us something very important about access to resources, especially electricity. The image shows other lights as well. The green dots show us natural gas flares, that is, sites where large amounts of oil and natural gas are produced. Notice the geographic concentrations of these in Russia, the Middle East, North Africa, the Gulf of Guinea. But notice that many of the places where oil and natural gas are produced are themselves not lit up with city lights. We don't see natural gas production in Texas because those lights are overwhelmed by the city lights from nearby urban areas. But this isn't the case in many of the other production sites. Why? And what does this suggest about development? And notice the blue lights on the map. These are fishing fleets, particularly concentrated off the coasts of Argentina and Japan. These fleets are chasing schools of fish as they migrate around the world's oceans. But what does this tell us about development? And finally, notice the red lights. These are fires concentrated at the time the image was taken in the jungles of Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Amazon. Much of these are parts of efforts to clear forests for both subsistence and commercial agricultural production. What does this tell us about development? And more generally, how would this image look different if we thought differently about development? In a sense, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals represent an effort to think differently about the development process. The SDGs were agreed upon in principle at the Rio +20 conference in Brazil in June 2012. The goals were designed as successors to the Millennium Development Goals and followed the same format as the MDGs, with broad goals supported by specific measurable targets to be achieved by set dates. But unlike the MDGs, the SDGs were developed following broad consultation between UN member states, the United Nations itself, non-governmental organizations, and incorporate some criticisms leveled against the MDGs, both in terms of their relatively narrow focus and their development through a closed process. There are 17 goals, and we won't go into detail on all of them, but very briefly, the goals include ending poverty, ending hunger and achieving food security, ensuring healthy lives, ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education, achieving gender equality and empowering women and girls, ensuring sustainable access to water and sanitation, ensuring access to energy, promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth and full and productive employment, building resilient infrastructure and sustainable industrialization, reducing global inequality, making cities safe, resilient, and sustainable, ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns, taking urgent action to address climate change, conserving the world's oceans, ensuring sustainable use of environmental systems, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, and strengthening partnerships for sustainable development. Let's look at just one of these in a bit more detail. Goal 2 is to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Like the MDGs, each broad goal in the Sustainable Development Goals is supported by specific targets and a number of indicator measurements. Goal 2, ending hunger, includes 8 such targets, such as 2.1, by 2030, end hunger and ensure access by all people, in particular the poor and people in vulnerable situations, including infants, to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food all year round, and 2.5, by 2020, maintain genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants, farmed and domesticated animals, and their wild-related species. And under each target, there are a number of indicator measures to assess progress towards meeting those targets. Under 2.1, for example, there are 5 indicators: the proportion of the population below minimum level of dietary energy consumption, the percentage of women of reproductive age with anemia, the prevalence of stunting and wasting in children under 5 years of age, the percent of infants under 6 months of age who are exclusively breastfed, and the percentage of women aged 15 to 49 who consume at least 5 out of 10 defined food groups. The thinking was that by providing specific targets and measures, the international community and its constituent members would be focused on progress in specific areas, and that those areas more closely aligned with a sense of progress broader than measures of economic activity traditionally associated with development. But the SDGs are hardly the only measure of progress and development. Over the years, countless other measures have been proposed, from relatively simple measures like literacy rates or the prevalence of hunger, to more complicated measures like Human Development Index or the Genuine Progress Indicator. And still others have advocated for more abstract notions such as self-realization as a proxy for development. One of the most interesting of these experiments has been the discussion of the intersection of happiness and development advocated by Bhutan through the idea of gross national happiness, or GNH. And one final observation: if the goal or purpose of economic growth is to improve the human condition and to improve people's life satisfaction, that is, to make people happier, there's an interesting relationship between happiness and economic growth that's worth briefly noting. In this chart, we have countries ranked by their per capita gross domestic product on the horizontal axis and their life satisfaction survey data ranked 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, on the vertical axis. An interesting relationship emerges. At the lower end of the scale, there's a direct correlation between growing GDP and happiness, where an increase in GDP seems to yield higher average happiness in society. But something happens about the $20,000 per capita GDP level. That relationship flattens out, and increases in GDP are no longer seen to be correlated as dramatically with increases in happiness. And indeed, at the highest levels, it appears that happiness may actually decline a bit as the economy grows. So what does all of this suggest about the idea of development? Do the Sustainable Development Goals capture an idea of a development that aligns with how you see it? Is gross domestic product a better measure? Or should we be looking for something else like happiness and life satisfaction? Let me know what you think in the comments section below, and thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.